So we saw a lot of things during the recent PlayStation 5 showcase. While the most important aspect being the release date and price for the system, we saw some really awesome looking games. That Harry Potter RPG is looking absolutely incredible, and Miles Morales Spider-Man is shaping up to be one of the very best PlayStation 5 launch titles that's also available on PS4. But I think many of us really underestimate the gravity of opening up the PlayStation 5 showcase with Final Fantasy XVI. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, surprising absolutely everybody except those who, forum dumpster dive for any and all types of leaks. One asterisk that we have to attach to this, and they actually opened up the showcase with it, this is not native PlayStation 5 gameplay. This is actually running on a PC that has comparable specs to the PlayStation 5. So similar to what Microsoft has been doing for the past year with the Xbox Series X marketing, it's the same thing for this game, Final Fantasy XVI. But despite the fact, I think the game looks really good. Now, of course, the game is still early in development. Square Enix has made that known that this game, heck, it doesn't even have a release year, let alone a release date. But the fact that they were able to show off tangible gameplay for it leads me to believe that maybe this game is farther along than a lot of us realize. Maybe, hopefully. Then again, this is Square Enix. It takes too long to do anything over there. Christ, could you imagine working at Square Enix and dealing with the cafeteria? You order a PB&J sandwich and you could watch the entirety of the Lord of the Ring trilogy, extended editions, have all that finished, and you still won't get your sandwich.
Why you boring me? I'm right.
So despite the fact that we potentially could be waiting anywhere from 18 months to 18 years for this upcoming game, that is a little bit of a bummer, but I gotta say, I am excited nonetheless, which is the feeling that I have not shared with the Final Fantasy franchise in, well, since 2006. So while the graphics of the game, of course, are going to be a major showcase, I think what's really interesting about this is the talent working on it. Yes, the people behind the scenes who are crafting the experience, because their resume, pardon my French, is fucking incredible. So let's just do a quick rundown of every single person we know that is working on Final Fantasy XVI. So the game is being produced by Naoki Yoshida, and if that name sounds familiar in any way, shape, or form, your suspicions are indeed correct, because Naoki Yoshida is no stranger to the Final Fantasy franchise. In fact, he spent the better part of his tenure working on Final Fantasy XIV. Yeah, y'all remember Final Fantasy XIV, that MMO that came out and it was just not good? Until Yoshida took the reins, he rebooted the game entirely and he gave us Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. And he's been working on the franchise. It's so crazy to consider Final Fantasy XIV its own franchise. He's been working on the game ever since, and he's just literally been doing, what's the term I'm looking for? God's work. And since we're on the topic of Final Fantasy XIV, can I just say that Final Fantasy XIV is probably going to go down as the best Final Fantasy game in so many different ways. Like, first things first, the story of how the game came to be, it being reborn, and then all the content they've been producing for it, and they've just been going above and beyond with every single expansion. The storytelling has just gotten out of control in a really good way, not a Tetsuya Nomura way where you're just scratching your head wondering how, why, who. The answer is indeed Xehanort. But to see Yoshida bringing his talents over to this game in a producer capacity is just welcome to the franchise going forward. But not only is Yoshida a Final Fantasy XIV veteran who's coming over, we have got writers who worked on Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward. Yes, they are bringing their writing talents to Final Fantasy XVI. And like I mentioned earlier, the writing and some of the storytelling in the Final Fantasy expansions is some of the best this series has ever gotten. Really mature stuff, great world building. You know, it's a lot of the things that we saw glimpses of with Final Fantasy 15, but the scale and scope of that game was just too much to handle in just one experience. Or so they say. They really did a tie-in movie and anime, and that shit still didn't make sense. So we got a producer from Final Fantasy XIV. We've got a writer from Final Fantasy XIV. Why rock the boat? Who is going to be directing Final Fantasy XVI? Well, it's going to be none other than Hiroshi Takai. Again, he is a veteran of the Final Fantasy XIV universe, but he's also worked on some other RPGs. I believe the last major game he worked on was The Last Remnant. Under normal circumstances, the fact that this guy has not directed a full-scale, big-budget title in over 10 years, that would be a cause for alarm. But considering he is Final Fantasy XIV 14 alumni. This man has been working with these people for so many years. It leads me to believe that this game is indeed going to be in the best of hands. Speaking of the best of hands, as I'm sure many of y'all have noticed, this gameplay is very, very action oriented. I definitely got some flashbacks from Final Fantasy 15, but honestly, in a really, really good way. While Final Fantasy XV's combat definitely left a lot to be desired, I could see kind of what they were going for in terms of that action experience. And evidently, I think Square Enix saw something with that system because they are going to be reintroducing it, stripping it down, getting back to fundamental basics. But who else to bring us some great action combat in a video game than somebody who spent the better part of their tenure working on some of the best action games around? So directing the combat for Final Fantasy XVI, we have Ryota Suzuki. While that name might not be familiar to some, for those who are a fan of his work and what he has done in the past, and who are skeptical about another action-based Final Fantasy title, you might want to rest those fears at the door, because this man, his credits include Devil May Cry 5 as one of the combat designers, Dragon's Dogma, Marvel vs. Capcom, 20-year tenure at Capcom. So if there's anybody who could give us a really good action, hack and slash focused Final Fantasy experience, it's gonna be a guy who worked on Devil May Cry 5. I'm just saying that much. And can we talk about the game's setting? Medieval dark fantasy. Oh my freaking god. Yes, that is definitely the nice change of pace the franchise has needed, because while I do like the idea of a more modern setting mixed in with some futuristic elements, but it is trying to be realistic to a degree, I do like that. But you know me, I'm very old school in that respect. You know, I love my medieval tales, I love fantasy, I love all of those things because that's how I grew up, and some of the best stories I've seen have been games in that particular time period. So to see them going back to that, man, yes. And like I mentioned earlier, while we don't have a good idea of how far along this game is in development, they have confirmed that the game is going to be releasing as a PlayStation 5 console exclusive, as far as we know anyways, because in the just few short hours since the PlayStation 5 event, Sony has actually pulled down trailers for a couple of games that said they were coming on to PC and they were going to be timed exclusive for the PlayStation console. So right now, even though it said it's going to be available on PS5 and PC, Sony is saying that it's only available on PS5. Now, whether this is a timed exclusive, which judging by a lot of Square Enix's games as of late, there's a high chance it might be, or this is going to be a PlayStation 5 console exclusive for life, and then it launches on PC down the road, which again is another high possibility. It remains to be seen, but 2021 is when Square Enix said we should check back for more information. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but I just can't get over the fact I am genuinely excited for a Final Fantasy game. And in this feeling I have not felt in close to 20 years, y'all. You know what I'm saying? But I think there is a reason why I am so excited for this. I am thoroughly convinced that the reason why I'm excited for this game and the talent working on it is because for the first time in 15 years, this represents a fundamental shift in Square Enix's development process. And I think that's due to the fact that this is the very first mainline Final Fantasy game since 2006 that actually looks like it has its own identity and there's competent people working on it. I know I have to explain myself on that one before people run with it saying, "What are you talking about, Square Enix hater?" Let's rewind the clocks a bit to 2006. What was the state of Final Fantasy then? Well, it was a tug of war between will they, won't they remake Final Fantasy VII and then the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy 13 universe. Like, that's what the universe was going to be going forward. We have Final Fantasy 13, Agito 13, Versus 13. And it's crazy how just in like 2-3 short years, we see how all that just came tumbling in on itself. You know, we didn't get 3 different 13 games. We got Final Fantasy 13, 13-2, 13-3. Versus 13 ended up becoming 15. And then Agito 13 was Type 0. And it just really threw a wrench in that plan of a cohesive, interconnected Final Fantasy universe that, you know, they had different stories, but they were all united by a common theme, a common element. That's what the Final Fantasy franchise has been dealing with for the past 15 years. They're still trying to get out of that shadow. You know, the Final Fantasy VII remake, while it's a good step in the right direction, it's still held back because it is a remake of a classic game that's trying to do things different, but at the same time, they don't want to really alienate their audience. So while it is a new Final Fantasy game for a new generation of people, it still relies heavily on you having played the older game to understand why them changing it could potentially be good or potentially be bad. And I don't even need to explain to y'all the development struggle that was Final Fantasy 15. It's a shell of what they originally showed us off in the past decade. But this one right here, I have hope for, because it just seems like, okay, they're listening to everything people had problem with. You know, like the story is kind of convoluted all over the place. Well, what's some of the best storytelling we've had as of late? Final Fantasy XIV. The combat system in Final Fantasy 15 really wasn't great. While the 7 remake was cool, it did divide some people. So let's get a person who's worked on some of the best games in the industry. Boom. And who else are we going to get to actually steer this project, make sure it's good, and release it in a timely fashion? We'll get a guy who directed some stuff at Final Fantasy 14, and we'll get the guy who freaking saved Final Fantasy 14. Dare I say, am I excited? But that's all I got for y'all today. Comment down below and let me know what y'all think about the announcement of Final Fantasy 16. Are y'all in this weird state of disbelief that this is actually happening, this is a thing, and it could potentially end up being really freaking good? That's the mindset I'm at right now. But let me know what y'all think about it, your honest interpretations and expectations for this upcoming Final Fantasy game. And from me to you for now, my name is NGS signing out. Like always, I will catch you guys later. Peace.